Alright, what's up everybody? It's your boy Akeem from the Football Source, here to talk about Week 5 of the 2014 Fantasy Football season. Here to give you my starters and benchers for this week in fantasy play. Starting at quarterback position, starting with Big Ben Roethlisberger of the Pittsburgh Steelers, facing against a poor Jaguars defense, one of the worst defenses against the pass this season in the National Football League. I think that Big Ben's going to be due for a big game. Next player I need to talk about, Jay Cutler out of the Chicago Bears. They played against the Carolina defense. Now, Carolina had a great year last season, but this year they're playing somewhat like a flop on defense, starting a couple weeks ago against the Pittsburgh Steelers. And I think because of that, Jay Cutler's going to have a pretty good day. I think he's going to predict that he's going to have at least 17 points in fantasy play this week. Next is Russell Wilson against the Washington Redskins. Now, Seattle has a big up front, and I think they're going to be due for a big game. Now, last week against the Giants, the Redskins allowed Eli Manning to have 32 fantasy points. I predict at least 22 for Russell Wilson in this matchup. Next player, Matt Ryan of the Atlanta Falcons. Now, I know a couple of you guys might be raising your eyebrows with this one. Matt Ryan, they're playing against the New York Giants, who had a great dominant performance last week against the Washington Redskins. But I think that was a little bit of a fluke last week against Washington. I'm not 100% bought on this Giants defense. Despite the fact that the offensive line is a little bit hurt for the Atlanta Falcons, I still think because of the poor ground attack for the Falcons, I'm going to have to go with Matt Ryan throwing the football in order to pull a victory. Now, players that you should sit this week, start with Tom Brady of the New England Patriots. Last week was a make or break for you guys, and he was a definite miss, so he's a player that you should definitely bench this week, possibly even drop for you guys. I suggest you guys to drop him. I'm not feeling him at all. Cam Newton of the Carolina Panthers. Now, he's not been playing like a dual threat quarterback in fantasy play. In fact, for the course of his career, his numbers have been dwindling a little bit in fantasy points overall. And last but not least, Kirk Cousins of the Washington Redskins. I had high hopes for him last week against the Giants. That was a definite flop in that one, and they're playing against a tough Seattle defense. If he gives you 20 points, I'm actually going to call this out, particularly for my fantasy football league. If he gives you 20 points against the Seattle Seahawks, I'm going to be the organ donor for my entire league. Seriously, I highly doubt Kirk Cousins is going to perform in this one, especially coming off a 7-point performance at home against the Giants. Now, a sleeper for you guys at quarterback, I'm going to have to go with Alex Smith for the Kansas City Chiefs against the San Francisco 49ers. I think he could give you possibly at least 15 points in that matchup. Now, they still have running back Jamal Charles coming back. He's had a great game last week against the New England Patriots, and I think because of Charles being back, it's going to open things up for the passing game just a little bit against that tough Niners defense, one of the top 5 defenses in the National Football League. Headed over to the running back position, Le'Veon Bell against the Jacksonville Jaguars. As I mentioned before, they have a terrible defense. Giovanni Bernard for the Cincinnati Bengals. I think this is going to be a good week against the New England Patriots, not only running the football, but even catching the football outside the backfield. He's been very productive because he's been giving you good touchdown on points in fantasy play, but I think the yardage is going to rack up in this particular matchup. He's going to be due for a big game. Andre Ellington of the Arizona Cardinals. Now, this was a little bit of a question mark for me because he's been dealing with that foot injury, and they're playing against a pretty good Bronco defense. I think he should definitely start him this week because for the past 2 weeks, the Broncos have been giving up 20-plus points in fantasy points. And I think he could be a good number 2 back for you guys in fantasy play. Last but not least, LaShawn McCoy of the Philadelphia Eagles. A lot of people have been doubting him, and I think he's going to be It's going to have a good comeback game against the St. Louis Rams, who's been giving up 25 points for the well over 17 points per game for the last 2 games. I think that St. Louis is going to have a hard game against the LaShawn McCoy, who should emerge in this matchup. Players that you should sit at running back, start with Alfred Morris against the Seattle Seahawks. Now, for only the 3 games that Seattle has played this season thus far, they have allowed only 28 fantasy points to the running back positions and all running backs in all. I think that Alfred Morris is going to have a bad game. Second player, Monty Ball against the Arizona Cardinals. Now, last week, their last game against Seattle, he had a terrible game, and even the running backs for Denver had a terrible game. Only posted up just one fantasy point. I think Monty Ball is not going to be a good starter for you guys. Niles Davis for the Kansas City Chiefs. Now with the emergence the comeback of Jamal Charles, that's going to actually dwindle Davis's touches for their matchup against the San Francisco 49ers. You should definitely sit him in this game. So a couple players I think you should guys go right ahead and start to replace the players that I talked about benching. CJ Spiller and Fred Jackson against the Detroit Lions defense. Even though it's a tough defense, but I think these two players are better fit than the players that I told you guys that you should bench. And also Zach Stacy against the Philadelphia Eagles. Philadelphia has been doing decent last week. They had a great game last week against the San Francisco 49ers, in which they posted 24 fantasy points, but they still have been struggling a little bit against the run. I think that Zach Stacy can have a good game against the Philadelphia Eagles. He's a good sleeper running back this week. Headed over to the wide receiver position, Percy Harvin of the Seattle Seahawks facing against a weak secondary from the Washington Redskins. He's a player that you should definitely start. A couple other players, Keenan Allen of the San Diego Chargers posted 135 yards last week. Finally emerged this week, 13.5 fantasy points. They're playing against a tough, a weak Jets defense who has been struggling against receivers this season. And same with another team who's been a defensive team who has been struggling against wide receivers, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and they're playing against the New Orleans Saints. So Brandon Cooks is a good start for you guys as a slot receiver. For receivers that you should sit this week, just about all the receivers for the Washington Redskins facing against Richard Sherman and that tough Seattle secondary with Sherman, Chancellor, and Thomas. That is a nasty secondary for the Seattle Seahawks, and I'm not sure if not one receiver for the Washington Redskins will emerge in this matchup. So I should think you should bench all the receivers overall for the Washington Redskins. Talk about Pierre Garçon and even Niles Paul, Jordan Reed, and Deshaun Jackson. Larry Fitzgerald of the Arizona Cardinals. Now, he has not been playing like the Fitz, the all-star, the all-pro player, caliber player that we've been seeing in recent seasons years ago. And he's not the same player, so he's another player you should bench. And he's actually projected to have under 600 yards receiving throughout the entire season. So I think you should definitely bench him against the Denver Broncos. And last but not least, Sammy Watkins of the Buffalo Bills. They're playing against a tough Detroit defense. Now, Sammy Watkins has been hot and cold throughout this season, and Detroit actually allows the second fewest points, receiver points in fantasy play. So I think that Sammy Watkins should be a player that you should bench this week. A couple of replacement players for you guys playing against the Dallas Cowboys is DeAndre Hopkins. I think that he could probably be a good replacement for these particular receivers. And Brian Quick of the St. Louis Rams, they're playing against the Philadelphia Eagles. Now he could be a good sleeper receiver this week for fantasy play. Headed over to the tight end position, I'm going to start off some players that you should definitely start. Martellus Bennett of the Chicago Bears. Now, believe it or not, he's actually leading all tight ends in points so far this season with 52 points according to ESPN. They're playing against the Carolina Panthers. I think you have another decent game. And sticking with the same matchup, Greg Olsen for the Carolina Panthers playing against the Chicago Bears. He's another player that you should start this week. And another player who actually has raised a lot of question marks, a player that most people even already decided to bench because he's been struggling this season, Jordan Cameron against the Tennessee Titans. Now, he's coming back from his shoulder injury, and last week Cleveland had a bye week, so he had more time to heal himself and that shoulder. I think you should go right ahead and start him against the Titans defense, who have surrendered 3 touchdown receptions and have actually averaged 10 points allowed per game to the tight end position. I think that Jordan Cameron can finally have a good game after starting off with a bad season so far. A couple players that you should bench this week. One player, a question mark, Travis Kelce out of the Kansas City Chiefs. They're playing against the San Francisco 49ers. Now, the 49ers have been doing pretty good against the tight end, minus the game against Martellus Bennett against the Chicago Bears. They actually allowed him to have 9 points in that matchup. But Kelce had a tremendous week last week against the the New England Patriots, but I think he's going to be struggling this week against the San Francisco 49ers, who allowed the second fewest points to the tight end position overall this season. But this is still a question mark. It's a little bit of a coin toss, but I'm going to have to go against Travis Kelce in this matchup. And also, Zach Ertz for the Philadelphia Eagles. They're playing against the St. Louis Rams. Now, for the last couple of weeks, Ertz has not been playing too well, and St. Louis has been doing a decent job against the tight ends. Zach Ertz is another player that you should bench this week. Last but not least, I need to talk about the defenses. I'm not going to talk about any kickers that you should bench or start, but I'm going to round things off with the defense. Seattle versus Washington. This is a gimme for Seattle. This should be a big game for the Seahawks to dominate against that Washington Redskin offense. We already saw what happened last week with the Giants played at Washington. Cincinnati Bengals versus the New England Patriots. I think you should definitely start the defense for Cincinnati. They're having a decent season so far this year in fantasy play. The San Diego Chargers, they're playing against the New York Jets. The Jets offense, and especially at quarterback with Geno Smith struggling, this should be a good, valuable play for fantasy points for coming from the San Diego Chargers, who's actually in the top 5 in points overall in fantasy play according to ESPN. A sleeper this week, the Philadelphia Eagles defense against the St. Louis Rams. Not too much of a sleeper. They were a major sleeper last week against the San Francisco 49ers, posting 20+ points, and I think they're going to have a decent game against the St. Louis Rams. I don't think it's going to be the same duplicate amount of points, but they should definitely have the starting nod this week. They're playing against Austin Davis. Now, Austin Davis did have 21 points and 2 weeks ago against the Dallas Cowboys, but we're still not really feeling too much. We're not really bought into Austin Davis. He might struggle in this matchup against the Philadelphia defense, so that should be another starter. Defenses that you should bench this week, starting with the New York Jets against the San Diego Chargers. Phillip Rivers is actually one of the front runners so far for the MVP for the National Football League. He's having a great season. I think he's going to torch that Jet defense. The Arizona Cardinals against the Denver Broncos. I mean, come on. Peyton Manning. Cannot doubt Peyton Manning. I do not suggest you guys to start Arizona's defense in this matchup. And last but not least, the Baltimore Ravens against the Indianapolis Colts and Andrew Luck, who's been doing a great job in fantasy points, one of the top scorers overall in fantasy points. I believe he is the top scorer in fantasy points so far this season. He's having a great year. He could actually make a run for MVP at the end of the season as well. So that wraps things up for this week. The next time I'm going to catch you guys will be on next Thursday, where I will talk about the Thursday night matchup, as well as later on next week, where I will talk about all the key players you should start and bench for week 6 of the fantasy football season. Thank you for watching today's blog from the Football Source. I'm your man, Keenan McCall. Be easy.